That target's at 3,200 meters, old-timer. Our system can't even get a lock, the young sergeant scoffed, his voice tight with the kind of frustration that only public failure can produce. With all due respect, you're in the way. The old man, Arthur, just nodded, his gaze fixed on a distant shimmer of heat rising from the California hills. He hadn't needed a computer 50 years ago, and a deep, quiet part of him knew he didn't need one now. All he needed was the feel of the wind on his weathered cheek, and a memory that had been forged in ice and fire. The soldier saw a frail visitor in a worn windbreaker, a relic invited for a legacy day. They had no idea they were speaking to the man who wrote the book they were failing to follow. Type legend, if you believe some skills never fade. Arthur Jenkins felt the vibration of the earth before he heard the next command. It was a familiar feeling, a low thrum that traveled from the soles of his worn orthopedic shoes up through his 82-year-old knees. It was the echo of heavy machinery, the hum of a modern army at work. He stood behind the yellow safety line, a designated observer in a world that no longer quite fit him. His jacket, a faded olive drab, hung loosely on his thin frame. Pinned almost invisibly on the inside lapel was a small tarnished insignia, the kind no one under the rank of general would recognize anymore. His hands, spotted with age and etched with the roadmap of a long life, had a fine, persistent tremor. It was a gentle palsy that vanished only when he was holding something with purpose. Right now they were tucked into his pockets still. He watched the young soldiers, all crisp lines and digital camouflage, swarm around the sleek, black M2 460mm mortar system. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, he had to admit. Light, portable, deadly, but it was tethered to a world he didn't understand. A world of tablets, laser rangefinders, and satellite uplinks. His world had been one of steel, instinct, and geometry sketched in the dirt with a stick. He had been invited to Fort Irwin as a guest of honor, a living link to the regiment's past. They'd given him a visitor's pass, a bottle of water, and a polite but distant escort to the live fire range. They saw a stooped old man, a mascot for a day, someone to be tolerated. What they failed to see was the way his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, missed nothing. He saw the subtle shift of the wind as it curled through the canyon pass, the way the mirage distorted the distant target flag, the nervous energy in the young sergeant's shoulders. Tucked into the breast pocket of his jacket, pressing lightly against his ribs, was a small leather-bound notebook. Its pages were yellowed and soft as cloth, filled with his own spidery handwriting, ballistic tables he'd calculated by hand in places whose names were now just footnotes in history books. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, a ghost walking through his own future. He was a man of analog skills in a digital age, and he was beginning to think his time was well and truly past. But what Arthur didn't know was that his simple visit was about to become the most important training exercise this unit had seen in a decade. The air on Range 4B was a cocktail of extremes. It smelled of hot metal from the mortar tube, baking in the sun, the sharp acidic tang of recently fired cordite, and the dry, ancient scent of desert dust kicked up by the boots of anxious soldiers. The sun was a relentless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and making the distant mountains wobble in the heat. Sergeant Kyle Keller stood over the lightweight handheld mortar ballistic computer, his knuckles white as he gripped the ruggedized tablet. On the screen, a stream of data flowed. Wind speed from a portable anemometer, GPS coordinates for the tube, and the target, barometric pressure, humidity. It was a God's eye view of the battlefield, a torrent of information that was supposed to make his job foolproof. Right now, it was making him a fool. Fire mission, grid 34-Niner-Echo, target Sierra-2. A voice crackled from the radio. Target Sierra 2 was a rusted-out husk of an old APC, positioned on a rising slope 3,200 meters away. For a 60mm mortar, it was a stretch, a shot that required precision and a bit of luck. Keller's squad had neither today. PFC, Eva Rostova, her face smudged with sweat and dirt, stood by the bipod awaiting his commands. She was young, barely 20, but her movements were deliberate and focused. She trusted her sergeant, trusted the tech. But trust was eroding with every failed shot. Deflection 2840, elevation 1250, Keller barked, reading the numbers off the tablet. He was shouting not for clarity, but to project a confidence he no longer felt. Two other soldiers, the gunner and assistant gunner, moved in a practiced but tense dance, adjusting the traverse and elevation knobs. "Set," the gunner called. "Hang it," Keller commanded. Rostova lifted a high-explosive round, its olive-drab casing cool in her hands. She held it over the muzzle for a beat, took a breath, and let it slide home. The thump was solid, a deep cough that sent the round arcing into the merciless blue sky. Every eye followed its invisible path. They waited. The seconds stretched, turning from anticipation to dread. Then a puff of smoke and dirt erupted from the hillside, a good 200 meters short and 50 meters to the right of the APC. A collective sigh of frustration went through the squad. This was their fourth miss. Their evaluation officer, Captain Davies, stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. The pressure was immense. 200 miles away, in a quiet, climate-controlled office at the Pentagon, Command Sergeant Major Marcus Thorne was having a very different kind of day. He was reviewing personnel files for an upcoming regimental reunion. His office was a testament to a storied career, glass cases holding medals, commendations signed by generals, a folded flag from a fallen comrade. His aide brought him a list of approved visitors for various bases. It was routine paperwork until his eyes landed on a name under the Fort Irwin roster. Jenkins Arthur, a veteran guest. Thorne stopped cold. He leaned forward, reading the name again as if it might change. He picked up his phone, his movements suddenly sharp and economical. He dialed the Fort Irwin Command Center. "This is CSM Thorne. You have a visitor on Range 4B. Name is Arthur Jenkins. I want a visual confirmation now." The failure of the fourth round seemed to break something in Sergeant Keller. The carefully constructed facade of the calm, competent NCO crumbled, replaced by raw, biting anger. He turned from the useless puff of smoke and glared at his squad. "What was that, people? Are we aiming for the county line? Rostova, did you check the bubble?" "PFC." Rostova flinched. "The bubble was level, Sergeant." "Well, it couldn't have been, could it? Because the round landed in freaking Arizona." He kicked at a loose rock, his frustration a palpable force. Arthur Jenkins, standing by the safety line, shifted his weight. He could feel the problem like a change in air pressure. It wasn't the bubble. It wasn't the gunner. It was the wind. The tablet was taking a reading from the anemometer positioned right next to them, but the wind here in the firing position was not the same as the wind halfway up that long sloping valley. There was a draw, a current of air being pulled down from the higher passes, invisible and unaccounted for by the technology. He had seen it 1,000 times before. It was a whisper of knowledge from a lifetime of observation. He took a half step closer, his curiosity overriding his intention to remain a silent observer. Keller, seeing the movement out of the corner of his eye, spun around. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. "Can I help you, sir?" The "sir" was a formality, stripped of all respect by the iciness of his tone. He was looking for a target for his anger, and the old man was the only one who wasn't part of his chain of command. Arthur met his glare with a calm, steady gaze. He offered a simple, slow shake of his head. "Just watching," he said, his voice quiet, raspy with disuse. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to momentarily unnerve the young sergeant. It was the quiet of a man who had seen real failure, real stakes, and knew this was not it. Keller held his gaze for a second longer, then snorted and turned back to his tablet, dismissing the old man as utterly irrelevant. He would show him. He would show all of them. He would make the technology work. Keller huddled with his gunner, stabbing a finger at the tablet's screen. Recalculate. Factor in a 5-mile-per-hour wind shift left to right. Tell the system it's wrong. It was a guess, a desperate attempt to bully the data into submission. The gunner looked skeptical, but did as he was told. Captain Davies watched, his arms still crossed. He knew what was happening. Keller was chasing the rounds, making adjustments based on the last failure instead of understanding the root cause. It was a rookie mistake, born of panic. Arthur stood his ground, a silent statue of dissent. He pulled a single blade of dry grass from the ground and held it up between his thumb and forefinger. He let it go. It didn't drift right, as Keller had guessed. It fluttered, hesitated, and then drifted almost imperceptibly to the left before dropping. The draw. It was pulling the rounds off target. He made a quiet comment, intended more for himself than for anyone else, a habit born from decades of working his craft alone. Wind's not pushing, it's pulling, from the high ground. His voice was low, but in a momentary lull between shouted commands, it carried. Sergeant Keller heard it. He straightened up as if he'd been struck. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing into slits. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Arthur just looked toward the distant hills. "There's a draw coming out of that pass. It's holding your rounds up and pulling them left. Your anemometer can't feel it down here." Keller walked over to him, stopping a foot away, using his height and the crispness of his uniform to impose a sense of authority. "And what would you know about it, Pop?" The word "pop" dripped with condescension. It was a deliberate verbal shove, meant to put the old man in his place. "You've been standing here for an hour. We've been training on this system for 6 months. I think we know what we're doing." Arthur didn't rise to the bait. He simply met the sergeant's angry eyes and held them. He didn't need to argue. The proof of his words was scattered all over the hillside, 200 meters short of the target. The silence stretched. Keller, getting no reaction, felt his own authority waver. He scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "Just stay behind the line. Let the professionals work." He turned his back on the old man, convinced he'd shut him up. He couldn't have been more wrong. That quiet observation was the first domino in a chain that would end his career as he knew it. Arthur stepped back behind the yellow line, the sergeant's dismissal washing over him without leaving a mark. He had dealt with young, arrogant NCOs his entire life. They were a constant, like the rising of the sun. Some learned, some didn't. He walked over to a stack of green ammo cans and sat down, his knees cracking in protest. The sun was hot on his neck. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the small leather notebook. The cover was worn smooth, the corners rounded from a lifetime of travel. He opened it carefully, the spine sighing in protest. Inside, the pages were a dense tapestry of ink. There were hand-drawn diagrams of trajectories, notes on the performance of different propellant charges in humid versus dry air, and pages filled with columns of numbers. His tables, they were calculations for windage, elevation, and drift, worked out longhand in the flickering light of a candle in a Korean winter, refined in the sweltering heat of a Vietnamese jungle, and perfected in places the Army no longer officially admitted to having been. He ran a trembling finger over a faded entry from 1953. The ink was brown with age. Chosin, temperature minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, M2 tube contracts. Add 4 mils elevation per 1,000 meters. Baseplate slipping on ice. Use sandbags. It wasn't just data. It was a diary of survival. He remembered that night with a clarity that 80 years could not dim. A freezing, desperate night surrounded with another young, arrogant lieutenant demanding a fire mission on a target they couldn't see. He'd made the shot then, just like this. No computers, no GPS. Just a map, a compass, his brain, and the feel of the frozen wind on his face. He'd dropped 3 rounds on an enemy machine gun nest and saved what was left of his company from being overrun. He felt the phantom weight of the old M2 mortar's baseplate on his back, a familiar ache that had never truly gone away. He looked up from the book at the chaotic scene on the firing line. The young soldiers were frantically trying to recalibrate their gear. Sergeant Keller was yelling into his radio. They were drowning in data, slaves to a machine that was feeding them lies. They were so busy looking at their screens that they had forgotten to look at the world. A profound sadness settled over him. This was what his legacy had become. A group of highly trained soldiers who couldn't hit the broadside of a mountain because they trusted a circuit board more than their own eyes. Sergeant Keller, that's 5 rounds, 5 misses. Captain Davies's voice cut through the air, sharp and final. He walked over, his shadow falling across the tablet in Keller's hands. The evaluation is over. I'm calling it. Panic, cold and sharp, flashed in Keller's eyes. A failed evaluation would be a black mark on his record, a stain on his squad. It meant remedial training, loss of privileges, and the crushing humiliation of being deemed combat ineffective. "Sir, request one more shot," Keller pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "We had a system malfunction. We've got it figured out now." "You said that 2 shots ago," Davies replied, his patience gone. "You have one final chance, Sergeant. 1 round. Hit the target, and I'll pass you. Miss, and your squad is on lockdown for the next rotation, relearning the basics. Is that clear?" "Crystal, sir," Keller said, his face pale. The weight of the ultimatum settled over the entire squad. The casual range day had become a career-defining moment. In his desperation, Keller's anger boiled over into a torrent of excuses. He gestured wildly at the distant target. "This is impossible. The crosswinds at that range are too unpredictable. The system can't compute it fast enough. No one could make that shot today." The words hung in the hot, still air, a declaration of surrender disguised as a complaint. From the stack of ammo cans, a new sound emerged, the soft creak of old joints, as Arthur Jenkins slowly pushed himself to his feet. He closed his notebook, tucked it carefully back into his pocket, and began to walk forward. He crossed the yellow safety line, his worn shoes scuffing in the dust. Every soldier stopped what they were doing and turned to watch him. He walked past the stunned squad, past the furious Sergeant Keller and stopped a few feet from Captain Davies. He didn't look at the captain. His pale blue eyes were fixed on the distant, shimmering target. Then, in a voice that was quiet, but carried with absolute certainty, he said, "I can." The two words dropped into the tense silence like stones into a still pond. There was a beat of stunned quiet, followed by a few nervous snickers from the younger soldiers. Sergeant Keller stared at him, his mouth agape, a look of pure disbelief on his face. But Captain Davies didn't laugh. He looked at the old man, at the unwavering confidence in his posture, the profound, unnerving calm in his eyes. And for the first time that day he hesitated. He didn't know that the last person to doubt that simple statement had been a 2-star general 50 years ago, just before Arthur Jenkins had saved an entire battalion with 3 perfectly placed rounds in the middle of a monsoon. Captain Davies was in a bind. On one hand, Army regulations were screaming in his head. You don't let a civilian, even a veteran guest, touch a live weapon system during an evaluation. The liability was astronomical. On the other hand, his professional curiosity was piqued, and his gut was telling him something extraordinary was about to happen. He looked from Keller's panicked face to Arthur's serene one. "Sergeant, get me the visitor's manifest," he ordered his radio operator. "I need to verify our guest's credentials." The operator fumbled with his radio. "Alpha 6, this is range control. Need to verify identity of a civilian guest. Name is Jenkins Arthur. Over." The request went out over the base's command net. It was a routine check, a box to be ticked. But the name, once spoken into the digital ether, began its rapid journey up the chain of command. It was flagged by an automated system, cross-referenced with a list of distinguished personnel. An alert popped up on a screen in the base operations center. The officer on duty saw the flag, read the attached file, and immediately patched the call through to the office of the base's command sergeant major, but CSM Thorne wasn't in his office. He was in his black SUV, racing down a paved access road that led toward the distant popping sounds of the live fire ranges. He had the phone pressed to his ear. "Sir, we have a request from Range 4B to verify a visitor, an Arthur Jenkins." Thorne gripped the phone tighter. "I'm already on my way," he said, his voice a low growl. "Do not let that man leave the range. Do not, under any circumstances, disrespect him. Tell Captain Davies I am 5 minutes out and to stand by." He hung up and turned to his driver, a young specialist who was already pushing the speed limit. "Step on it, son," Thorne said, his eyes fixed on the plume of dust rising from the ranges ahead. "History is happening, and we're not going to be late." Back on the firing line, the radio operator turned to Captain Davies. "Sir, command says to stand by. The base CSM is en route. They said to extend Mr. Jenkins every courtesy." The message was bizarre, and its effect was immediate. A ripple of confusion went through the group. Sergeant Keller, however, saw it as an unacceptable breach of protocol. "You're not actually considering this, are you, sir?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You're going to let this civilian touch my team's weapon system during a qualification?" "He's a veteran of this regiment, Sergeant," Davies said, his tone sharp, silencing Keller's protest. "And command just told me to be nice to him. So, for the next 5 minutes, he is our guest. Show some respect." Davies turned to Arthur. "Sir, what did you have in mind?" Keller, seething, reluctantly stepped aside, muttering under his breath to his squad. "This is a joke. Watch this. The old fossil will probably drop the round on his own foot." He folded his arms, a smirk of anticipated vindication on his face. He was already composing the story he would tell at the NCO club later, a hilarious tale of the day. The brass made them let some senile old vet play with the mortars. He was certain the old man would make a complete fool of himself, proving Keller's point about the complexities of the modern system, but what none of them knew, not Keller, not the captain, not even Arthur himself, was that a black SUV was now cresting the final hill overlooking the range, its tires kicking up a rooster tail of dust. The man sitting in the passenger seat held the key to everything, and he was about to unlock a history none of them were prepared for. Arthur paid no mind to the drama swirling around him. The sergeant's scorn, the captain's curiosity, the impending arrival of some high-ranking officer, it was all just noise. He walked toward the mortar tube with a slow, deliberate gait. The tremor in his hands was gone, replaced by a profound stillness. He was home. He ignored the tablet, the GPS unit, the digital sight. He knelt beside the bipod, his old knees groaning, and placed a hand on the cool metal of the cannon. He was reacquainting himself with an old friend. PFC Rostova, he said, his voice calm and clear. She looked at him, then at Sergeant Keller, who gave a sharp, angry shake of his head. Rostova hesitated. "Give the man what he asks for, Private," Captain Davies commanded. Rostova nodded and moved to the ammo cans. "What charge, sir?" she asked. "Charge 2, Arthur said without hesitation. "We don't need to push it. Just need to loft it." He looked up at the sky, his eyes squinting against the glare. He wasn't looking at the clouds. He was reading the air. He felt the subtle pressure on his cheek, the whisper of the breeze through the dry grass. He plucked another blade of grass, held it up, and watched it fall. He glanced at the distant mountain pass, noting the way the heat haze was bending. He was performing 1,000 tiny calculations in his head, a complex organic algorithm refined by decades of experience. Deflection, he murmured to himself, add 22 mils. He reached for the traversing handle and gave it 2 full turns and a slight, precise nudge. The movement was fluid, economical, the muscle memory of a lifetime taking over. "Elevation," he said, louder this time, for the gunner's benefit. 7,800 mils. Sergeant Keller let out a short, derisive laugh. "Sir, that's from a manual firing table from the 1970s. It doesn't account for muzzle velocity variation or non-standard atmospheric conditions. It's not accurate." Arthur stopped and looked directly at Keller for the first time. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, unassailable certainty. "It is," he said softly, "if you know how to read the world." He gave the elevating handle a final, minute adjustment. The tube was now pointing at what seemed to be an impossibly high angle. It looked wrong. It looked like a mistake. But Arthur just nodded to himself, satisfied. He had made his calculations. He was ready. The black SUV came to a hard stop 50 feet from the firing line, its engine cutting off abruptly, leaving a sudden ringing silence. The dust settled, revealing the single star of a brigadier general's office insignia on the door, but it was the man who stepped out of the passenger side who commanded all the attention. Command Sergeant Major Marcus Thorne was a mountain of a man, his uniform so crisply pressed it looked like it could cut glass. His face was a stern mask of authority, and as his boots hit the ground, every soldier on the range, including Captain Davies, snapped to the position of attention. Sergeant Keller's jaw went slack, his earlier arrogance evaporating into pure shock. The base CSM did not make range calls. ever. Thorn's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the mortar, the stunned soldiers, the captain, and finally settling on the old man in the worn jacket kneeling by the weapon. Thorn's entire demeanor changed. The stern mask dissolved, replaced by something akin to reverence. He strode forward, his pace purposeful. He walked past Captain Davies without a glance. He walked past the petrified Sergeant Keller as if he were a piece of range equipment. He walked directly to Arthur Jenkins. He stopped precisely 2 feet in front of the old man, who was now slowly getting to his feet. Thorn drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and executed the sharpest, most profound salute of his entire decorated career. It was a gesture of such deep, heartfelt respect that it stunned the onlookers into absolute silence. Sergeant Major Jenkins, Thorn's voice boomed across the range, the sound raw with emotion. "It is an honor, sir." Arthur returned a slow, weary salute, a gesture from a bygone era. Thorn dropped his hand and turned to face the bewildered assembly of soldiers. His eyes were blazing. "You people have no idea who this is, do you?" he demanded, his voice laced with a fury that was almost holy. "You see an old man. I see a giant. This is Arthur Ghost Eye Jenkins. He didn't just follow the doctrine on high-angle mortar fire in combat. He wrote it, with enemy rounds landing 20 meters from his position." He pointed a trembling finger at the leather notebook visible in Arthur's pocket. "That book? That's not a diary. That is the original manuscript for Army Training Circular 3-22.90. It's now required reading at the infantry school. They call it the Jenkins Tables." Every soldier on that range froze. The name Ghost Eye Jenkins echoed in their minds, a name from classroom lectures and history books, a legendary, almost mythical figure who could supposedly drop a mortar round into a coffee cup from 2 miles away. They were standing in the presence of a ghost. But what even Thorn didn't know was the full story of why he got that name, a story Arthur was about to demonstrate for them all. Arthur seemed not to have heard a word C.S.M. Thorn said. The commendations, the revelation of his identity, it was all external, irrelevant to the task at hand. His world had shrunk to the mortar tube, the round, and the target. The past was a ghost, but the physics of the present were real and demanded his complete attention. He turned his head slightly, his pale eyes finding PFC Rostova, who was standing frozen, holding a high explosive round as if it were a holy relic. "Ready, soldier?" he asked, his voice unchanged. She blinked, snapping out of her daze. She looked at the living legend before her, then at the round in her hands, and a new kind of resolve settled on her face. This was no longer an evaluation. It was a lesson. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Arthur gave a single, sharp nod in return. "Hang it!" The command was soft, but it cut through the silence with the authority of a thunderclap. Rostova stepped forward. She held the round over the muzzle, her movements now imbued with a reverence they had lacked before. She took a breath, just as he had done in his mind 1,000 times, and let it slide from her fingers. The thump of the firing pin hitting the primer was different this time. It wasn't just the sound of a weapon firing. It was the sound of history repeating itself. It echoed off the distant hills, a punctuation mark at the end of CSM Thorn's speech. Every single person on the range, from the command sergeant major down to the youngest private, held their breath. All eyes turned skyward, trying to follow the invisible arc of the projectile. The seconds stretched into an eternity. 1 second, 2. The world was silent save for the whisper of the wind. 3, 4. Sergeant Keller found he was holding his breath, a knot of dread and something he couldn't name tightening in his stomach. 5, 6, 7. Just as a flicker of doubt began to enter the minds of the onlookers, perhaps the legend was just a legend after all. A flash of brilliant light erupted on the distant hillside. It wasn't near the target. It wasn't close to the target. It was a direct, perfect, catastrophic hit. The flash was followed a moment later by the deep, satisfying crump of the explosion, and a plume of black smoke rose from the exact spot where the APC had been. A collective, involuntary gasp swept through the crowd. The target was gone. Sergeant Keller stood as if turned to stone, his face ashen. The smirk he'd worn just minutes before now, a mask of utter, soul-crushing humiliation. Silence descended on Range 4B once more, a heavy, profound silence broken only by the crackle of the captain's radio. Spotter confirms, direct hit. I repeat, direct hit on target Sierra 2. Target is destroyed. End of transmission. The disembodied voice from the radio was flat, professional, and yet it sounded like a verdict being read. Captain Davies slowly lowered the handset, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at the smoking wreckage in the distance, then back at the old man who stood calmly beside the mortar tube. Command Sergeant Major Thorne broke the stillness. He walked over to Arthur and placed a heavy, respectful hand on his shoulder. "Still got the eye, Sergeant Major," he said, his voice thick with pride. Arthur finally allowed the tension to leave his body. He gave a slow, tired nod. The mission complete. The tremor returned to his hands, a faint vibration that spoke of the immense concentration he had just expended. He looked over at Sergeant Keller, not with triumph, not with anger, but with a kind of weary, sad understanding. He saw not an arrogant NCO, but a scared young man, overwhelmed by the responsibility of leadership and betrayed by a misplaced faith in his tools. Keller, for his part, could not meet the old man's gaze. He stared at the ground, at his own boots, at anything but the pale blue eyes that had seen through his bluster and insecurity. His world had been turned upside down in the space of a single mortar round. P.F.C. Rostova looked at Arthur with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. She wasn't looking at a visitor anymore. She was looking at a living monument, the embodiment of a skill and an ethos she had only read about. She finally understood that the most powerful weapon in the Army's arsenal wasn't the technology, but the mind of the soldier who wielded it. Keller thought the humiliation was over. It wasn't. CSM. Thorne turned to him, his face a mask of cold, hard granite, and said 4 words that would change the sergeant's entire perspective on the Army. "Tell me what you learned." The question was not an accusation. It was an order. It was a demand for introspection, a command to grow. Sergeant Keller looked up, his face a mixture of shame and confusion. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had learned that his technology could fail. He had learned that his own judgment was flawed. He had learned that he had shown profound disrespect to a man who deserved the highest honor. I learned that I was wrong, Command Sergeant Major, he stammered. Good, Thorne said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. That's the beginning. Your new assignment, Sergeant, is Mr. Jenkins. You will be his personal escort for the remainder of his visit. You will get him whatever he needs, water, food, a ride, and you will listen. You will not talk. You will not offer opinions. You will not try to impress him. You will simply listen. Understood? Yes? "Command Sergeant Major," Keller said, his voice barely a whisper. And so began the most important day of Sergeant Keller's military career. He spent the next 6 hours in the company of Arthur Jenkins. At first, the silence was awkward, heavy with Keller's unspoken apology. But Arthur did not lecture. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply started to talk. He told stories not of glory, but of hardship. He spoke of the biting cold, the weight of the gear, the importance of knowing how to read the seams in the earth to find a stable place for the base plate. He took Keller and Rostova back to the mortar. He showed Rostova how to ignore the digital level and use the subtle reflection of the sky on the fluid in the sight bubble to find a true level. He showed her how to feel the texture of the wind on her face and know its strength. He made them both lie on the ground and feel the vibrations, teaching them how a solid patch of earth felt different from a hollow one. The story of the impossible shot and the legend who made it spread across Fort Irwin like wildfire. By evening chow, every soldier on the base knew the name Ghost Eye Jenkins. The next day, Sergeant Keller's squad had their re-evaluation. Keller used the tablet, but he didn't trust it blindly. He had Rostova check the wind the old way. He consulted a printed copy of the Jenkins tables he'd acquired from the base library. They fired 3 rounds at 3 different targets. All 3 were direct hits. They qualified with the highest score the range had seen all year. In the end, it was never about the single shot. It was about what that shot represented. It was a thunderous reminder that technology is a tool, not a replacement for fundamental knowledge. A GPS can be jammed, a battery can die, a screen can crack, but the skills etched into a soldier's mind by experience and discipline are indelible. Sergeant Keller was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility and a new voracious appetite for knowledge. He requested and was granted permission to add a fundamentals block to his squad's weekly training, focusing on map reading, compass work, and manual gunnery, the very skills he had once dismissed as obsolete. PFC Rostova became his most eager student, filling a new notebook of her own with the wisdom Arthur had shared. The incident on Range 4B became a case study, discussed in NCO development courses across the Army, a lesson in the dangers of over-reliance on technology and the enduring importance of respecting the wisdom of those who came before. A week later, Arthur Jenkins sat on his small porch back home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. He held a letter in his hand, a handwritten note from Sergeant Keller. It wasn't an apology, it was a thank you. It spoke of lessons learned and a new direction found. Tucked inside was a photograph of Keller's squad, standing proudly by their mortar, with a small handwritten sign propped against it. The sign read, "Ghost Eyes Apprentices." A small, rare smile touched Arthur's lips. The torch had been passed. True legends don't always wear their medals on their chests. Sometimes they carry them in the quiet dignity of a life well lived. They are the quiet heroes among us, the foundations upon which the future is built. Subscribe for more stories that honor their legacy.